I just want to take a moment as Dean of the York College Center for Community Engagement to welcome all our guests and to welcome our panelists and moderator. First thing I want to say is thank you to this group of individuals who have taken the time to share their expertise with the community as well as our college community. It is really part of our mission at the Center for Community Engagement and at York College to provide this kind of unbiased and really informed information in situations of, not only here in New York, but around the world. And we are fortunate enough to have with us at York College 3 colleagues who really can speak to this in ways that show both from their own experience and also from their own studies in ways that will help us all better understand the situation that is unfolding in Europe. As part of our role as a Center for Community Engagement, we do encompass the Arthur J. Glatfelter Institute for Public Policy. Vinny Cannizzaro is the director of that Public Policy Institute, and he will act as our moderator tonight and introduce our 3 panelists. So let me just end by thanking all of the people once again for being here and for the panelists for sharing their expertise with us. And I'll turn it over to Vinny. Thank you.
Thanks, Dominic. And thank you all for coming. Before we start, I'd like to introduce our panel. Like Dominic said, we have 3 great faculty members that are with us tonight. First, we have Charles Kauffman. Chip is an adjunct professor of Russian language and world languages here at your college. He spent over 3 decades working as a language analyst and a senior level foreign affairs officer for the US government in Washington, D.C. Chip spent much of his career working closely with NATO partners and with the US military on various projects throughout Europe. He's a lifelong student of Russian and other languages and was a university student in the former Soviet Union and traveled throughout Russia following his retirement from government services. Chip, thank you for joining us. Next, we have John Weaver. Dr. John Weaver is an associate professor of intelligence analysis here at your college as well. Before joining York in 2015, John spent 5 years working for the intelligence community as a civilian in the Department of Defense. Prior to this, he served 20 years in the US Army, finally retiring as lieutenant colonel. For the last 6 years of his Army career, John worked at an operational level at the NATO headquarters in Europe. John, thank you for joining us as well. And then finally, we have Dr. Claudia Lewis. Claudia is an associate professor of nursing and is a board certified advanced public health nurse and an active advocate and researcher as an Edmund J. Safra visiting nurse scholar for the Parkinson's Disease Foundation. She's a trained disaster preparedness responder, having worked for 7 years as part of FEMA's disaster medical assistance team, as well as her continued work with the American Red Cross disaster action team. Claudia is also the current regional nurse leader for the Central Pennsylvania Red Cross. She was born and raised in Poland, and Claudia is currently working with the State University of Applied Sciences in Włocławek, Poland, as part of the Global Engagement Initiative here at your college. Claudia, thank you for joining us as well. So I would like you all to have the opportunity to chat and really give us some great information about the state of Ukraine, what is going on, where we can go from here. And I'm going to turn it over to Chip.
Привет всем. Здравствуйте. Hello. That's Ukrainian and Russian. The world is in a different place today. Having spent my entire life since the age of 12 with studying languages, especially Russian, having served in Germany, 3 different tours in England, working with NATO, I never believed we would be here today. I would like to talk about a couple of things. I have 5 points I would like to raise, and I'll go through the first 3 and then give Dr. Weaver an opportunity to talk about some other aspects of the issue. And then perhaps I could come back later and do the other points that I want to go through. The 5 points I want to discuss are the early history. Why should I worry about the early history? Well, for each of these points, there is a premise that Putin has used to base an invasion on Ukraine. So first of all, he has talked about the early history that that Ukraine was always part of Russia and the Slavic people are all Russian and so forth. So I would like to discuss that because the actual early lands belonged to the Kievan Rus. So I would like to talk about that. The issues involving language, I won't get into too much of that, but Vladimir Putin has also raised the reason for invading Crimea, which was part of Ukraine in 2014, based on largely on the fact that they were mostly Russian-speaking people. And I would like to address that briefly. And the third point that I'd like to cover is Putin from 1990 to 2014. The 1990s are what really got him riled up, and it is largely the reason that we're here today with this crisis. The fourth point I'd like to bring up is Putin the man. I've had family and friends have always asked me, what do you think about Vladimir Putin? And from the very beginning, the night that he was installed on December 31st, 1991, I remember that night vividly. I was celebrating New Year's Eve, but I was in contact with people in Washington that evening. Putin is a chess player. I've said this many times. Putin is a chess player. He is always looking ahead. He's always developing a strategy for 10, 15, 20 moves ahead. So he very much enjoys the competition of, if I do this, I want to see how you react, and I'm going to make this move. So he's very much a smart man, but he's possessed with the idea that the Soviet Union will come back in its greatness. If not called the Soviet Union, it would be called Greater Russia. The last point that I want to bring up is Putin's inner circle. And I just would like to address that briefly. And I'm raising these right now just to give an introduction to this particular topic today on the panel. His inner circle is what guides him. And with all dictators, which I'm going to call him a dictator, he's authoritarian, but he has become a dictator. All dictators have an inner circle, and his inner circle is comprised of, comprises the siloviki. The siloviki in Russian is a word that means the men of the forces. They are the people who served in the security services. So those are the 5 points I would like to discuss. I'll start off with the first 3, and I'll try to keep my points brief. So the relevant points from early history, why is this important? Again, Putin has talked about Mother Russia and the Greater Russia. This is why he believes it's in their manifest destiny for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus to come back together. The Ukrainians are not Lesser Slavs. The word Slav comes from the early Slavic languages, meaning the people of praise, Slava. 6,000 years ago, I know that sounds like, why is he going into 6,000 years ago? It's important. The early people in the Pontic steppes of present-day Ukraine were known as Indo-Europeans. If you speak English as a native language, your language came from those early tribes. Those tribes are in present-day Ukraine. This is the Yamnaya culture, the Kurgan culture. But Kiev grew out of those tribes. The Slavic languages grew out of those tribes. From Russian, the primary chronicle, the Povest Vremennych Let, was written by monks and the clergy, and they put the Kievan Rus at 850 to about 1100 Common Era AD. The people who gave Russia their name were Swedish Vikings, known as Varangians. They were called Ruotsi, and Ruotsi is a Finnish word, a Uralic word that refers to the Swedish Vikings. So this is where the word Rus comes from. They established an area in Kiev, in the area of present-day Kiev, which goes back to around the late 400s Common Era. Kiev became a center of the Slavs in 850 AD and survived till around 1100. Moscow, according to monastic chronicles, did not develop until 1147 Common Era, when it was first mentioned. So the Kievan Rus is important because it was originally land that is in the present-day Ukraine. My second issue involves language. For those of you who are bewildered over whether to pronounce it Kiev or Kiev, you're right if you use it either one. Kiev is the Ukrainian word. Kiev is the Russian word for that particular city. Russian is not, Ukrainian is not a dialect of Russian. They are distinct Slavic languages, although they're sister languages, and there are many differences. The languages of Crimea that Putin based one of his reasons for invading and taking over Crimea illegally was that Russian was the primary language of its speakers. There happened to be three languages spoken there: Ukrainian, Russian, and Crimean Tatar. Crimean Tatar is a Turkic-based language, which is a relative of Turkish, Uzbek, Kazakh, and so forth. As far as native languages are concerned, in Ukraine, 68% of the Ukrainians speak Ukrainian as a native language. Ukrainian has a lot of similarities with Polish, but it's still a sister language to the East Slavics. 29% of Ukrainians speak Russian as a native language, and they're mostly in the East, in the Donbass and in the Crimea. So there are, just because people speak a language that belongs to another majority language of another country doesn't make it part of that country. That's like saying there are Canadians who speak English, therefore we should invade Canada. Or the French speak French and the Belgians speak Walloon, which is a form of French, therefore we should invade Belgium. I mean, the argument is specious. The last point, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Weaver. The last point is, I think some history is really important to understand how did we get to this? Having studied the Soviet Union for so many years, I never dreamed that they would fall. Having been a student there, I never dreamed it would disappear. Putin called the collapse of the USSR the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. That's a quote. He's also quoted as saying, the greatest mistake in modern history. Now, here's a guy who, after he became president, 5 months after he became president in 1999, December 31st, by May, he brought back the Soviet national anthem. Not the words, not all the words, but the song. So here's a man who was obsessed with bringing back the former Soviet Union. In June of 1990, Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada, which is the Ukrainian Supreme Parliament, passed a declaration of state sovereignty. This was self-determination, the rule of the people, economic independence, a democratic state. And they took that to the United Nations. The man who delivered that for Ukraine gave that proclamation in English because he didn't want to use the Russian language. English and Russian are both languages of the United Nations. In that referendum, there was a referendum that the Ukrainians voted on. 92% of the Ukrainians voted for independence away from being tied to the Russians. That's important. So we're looking at 1991, there was a referendum, the Ukrainians voted for independence. The USSR ceased to exist in December of 1991. I mentioned before I said 1991, it was 1999 when Putin came in. Since that time, Putin has been obsessed with bringing back the troika of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The 2004 election, that whole declaration in the United Nations in 1991 enraged Putin, a former KGB officer, and he later became the head of what used to be the KGB, which is the Federalная служба безопасности, which is the federal service, security service. 2004, the election in Ukraine, there was post-West Viktor Yushchenko, who was competing against the pro-Russia candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. Yushchenko coincidentally was poisoned. Gee, I wonder how that happened. Yushchenko was poisoned and he became grossly disfigured while he was eating. The election went to Yanukovych, who was pro-Russia, and the people of Ukraine became enraged. They protested, and that gave us the Orange Revolution. A revote for that election gave the presidency to Yushchenko, the pro-West guy. And then he served as president, and later Yanukovych won in another election that was considered fraud. I'm almost done with this point, and then I'll turn it over. Yanukovych, under Moscow pressure, canceled a trade deal between Ukraine and the EU. This was 2010. So 12 years ago, Ukraine was working out a trade deal with the European Union. Finally, 2014, the Ukrainians rose up and forced out Yanukovych in what was known as the Revolution of Dignity to restore democracy. It was also known as the Maidan Revolution. Putin was so enraged, he conducted the Olympics that year in 2017, early in February in Sochi. And 3 days after the Olympics, Putin annexed Crimea. And that's the historical background that I believe is germane to this situation. So Dr. Weaver, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, hey, thanks, Chip. I appreciate that. I'm going to kind of go back a little bit, kind of focusing on more of the contemporary issues and kind of look at the annexation of Crimea as a point of departure, kind of moving forward. Just again, to understand context, Russia as a country consists of 140 million people. It spans 11 time zones and ranks 11th in the world in terms of GDP. It's ranked at $1.6 trillion US dollars. And I think it's also important to note that Russia, in relation to the United States, though it, in terms of absolute dollars, spends less on defense than the United States, proportionally to the GDP, it spends more than the United States. And I'm one of these that kind of tracks the money and sees where the emphasis is. So they're spending roughly 4% versus 3.5% here in the United States. And they have an active military of 850,000 troops. I can go into more specifics later on in the presentation about the breakdown of their military, but one of the key things I want you to take away is they've got a significant naval force. Countries that invest in aircraft carriers, those are not defensive weapons. Those are offensive weapons because they are designed to project power well beyond the littoral range, going 12 nautical miles out from one's coastline. And we can kind of go into more specifics on that later if you want as well. Historically, if you look at what's happened over the last couple hundred years or so, Russia has experienced significant invasions. So I ask that you kind of look at NATO and what's been going on with its eastward expansion through the lens of Russia, kind of playing the devil's advocate here and maybe seeing how Russians perhaps see the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, even though it is one that is set up to be a defensive organization. And when you go into the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of '91 and the subsequent fallout, Ukraine actually gave up the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't take the nuclear weapons with them at that time. And as a result of various protocols, the Lisbon Protocol and the Budapest Memo, there were supposed to be security parameters in place among the countries of the UK, the US, and Russia not to invade Ukraine. And again, kind of moving farther and kind of departing from what Chip covered with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Russia's also been actively involved in what we call hybrid warfare in the Donbas region, which Chip already covered, where Putin has been using, let's say, somewhat what we call mercenaries, like the Wagner Group, which are people designed to do his bidding to kind of stir up issues. And I kind of see this as his way of testing the waters to see what the strength of the resolve was with Ukraine regarding a possible future incursion, which is where we are now. Why is Ukraine important? Well, in terms of natural resources and value, it's one of the more significant producers of wheat in the country. As a result of the recent invasion, wheat prices have gone up. And those that are looking to produce things like bread are seeing some significant challenges, and it's starting to affect the price of this in grocery stores. And one of the things I'd like to cover too is, again, through the lens of Russia, how they see things. In recent years, we've expanded, based as a result of Russia's annexation of Crimea. We have significantly plussed up NATO forces in a lot of Eastern European countries, the countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And you can see the breakdown nationally and by numbers in this slide. This was basically captured from a NATO website just 2 days ago. So again, looking at things through the lens of Putin, he's seeing an encroachment on former Soviet territory, buttressing very close to Russia's western flank there. Later on, I can cover the phases of military operation. The bottom line up front is I see that Russia's currently between phase 2 and phase 3 with a stalling of efforts there. And later in the presentation, I can go over some of what I consider US missteps that perhaps led to this perfect storm, which ended up in seeing Russia actually moving across the border in Ukraine, into Ukraine in February of this year. The last thing I'll say is I'm happy to see that several of our students are currently on are part of this discussion. And I know at least 2 were part of a master's course that I taught in the fall of 2020. And our master's students actually produced a book on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization called NATO in Contemporary Times. And I'm not trying to sell the book. It's actually in the library at your college. So if you are interested in checking that out and learning more after the presentation, that book is available to you. But I'll basically close it there. And we can go into more details later after Claudia presents. And Claudia, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thanks, John. Claudia, before you jump in, I just want to let everyone know our chat has been disabled, but if you have any questions as we go forward, feel free to drop them into the Q&A and I'll be monitoring them and we will be able to begin to answer questions. Claudia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you for joining us today. So I will be talking about the crisis in Ukraine from obviously a healthcare perspective and disaster perspective. But I want to start by sharing maybe a little bit of my personal story, since we just have 2 faculty members that went into a history of Europe and stuff. So you probably all know that Poland was a communistic country under a Russian kind of policy up until 1989. So most of my life that I lived in Poland, I lived under a Russian communistic country in Poland. And I'm going to say that a lot of our history to us at that time was not told to us as it really happened, especially with the Second World War. I remember in the elementary school, for example, learning that the Second World War started by German invading us. Nobody told us or shared with us that Russia also at the same time attacked us from the other side. And when the communistic Poland ended, and again 1989, that's where we all learned the truth. So, you know, I know you're hearing a lot in the news about people in Russia being fed information that it's incorrect, and I can vouch for that, that's probably happening because it happened to us when we were their communistic country. Also, during us being communistic country, everything was split evenly amongst people. And some of us may think that this is really great. However, you know, people that have a little bit more had their property ripped apart and was given to, you know, people that were siding with a party in the same, at this particular time that was following Ukrainian, not Ukrainian, Russian politics. People that were against it, it was happening exactly what you see probably in the TV happening to Russian citizens that are voicing their voice. They were taken and beaten and threatened and locked in jail. We had a police hours, so anybody that was on the street after 10 p.m. was locked in jail and questioned because you were not allowed to be on the streets. We were not allowed to have crosses in schools and all sorts of other things. So I just want you to kind of understand that, you know, although we're hearing that people in Russia are saying there's a lot of false news, probably they don't know the whole truth, what is happening out, because they were just being fed what is convenient to Putin at this time. But so that's a little bit of background, and Polish people are very much so heart to heart with Ukrainians because just like some of my colleagues said, you know, language is similar, culture is similar. So you see a lot of refugees flooding to Poland because of those similarities. It's kind of mostly comfortable for them. It's the closest to what they recognize at this time. And I will be talking a little bit to you about what is disaster, and especially war, because war is considered a man-made disaster. And we usually think of disaster as something that it's caused by nature, like tornado or flood. But war is considered a man-made disaster, as disasters are also caused by socio-political conflict that escalated into the violence, exactly what we see right now in the Ukraine. And man-made disaster have an element of a human intent or a negligence or an error that's involving from a failure of a man-made system, as opposed to natural disaster that's resulting from a natural hazards. Thus, any war that it's including, the one that we are discussing today is considered a man-made disaster. So consequently, since a war is an event that threatens the health and safety of well-being of a large group of people, I'm going to start discussing briefly a second point that I have for today is a humanitarian crisis. And subsequently, because of the war, people are threatened and their health is being threatened. Specifically, people that are soldiers on Ukrainian side and Russian sides, civilians, health personnel, and others that are involved. And that is considered a humanitarian crisis. So humanitarian crisis is an emergency situation that affects the entire community or a group of people in the region. Thus, Ukraine and Poland right now soon will be probably experiencing a humanitarian crisis. That will be it that I have for right now, because I want the guys to talk a little bit more about the history before I go into discussing a little bit more about humanitarian crisis. and how to help others. So Vinny, I'm going to give it back to you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Claudia. Chip, John, if you want to keep going, I'd like to take another about 15 minutes and then we'll jump into the question and answer session.
Okay, sure. Let me cover some of the points regarding phases of military operations. So we basically have 5 phases that we look at, phases 1 through 5. Phase 1 is where we look to deter while we basically build up. This is basically what was taking place over the months preceding the attack by Russia, basically building up ostensibly to counter what they perceived, what they thought was a threat from Ukraine. Phase 2 deals with what we call seizing the initiative. This is where oftentimes before we introduce ground forces, we basically prep targets, what we call centers of gravity, command and control nodes, logistics activities, etc., with missiles and airstrikes. We also want to take out key air defense systems, which Russia did. Phase 3 is where a military transitions to what we call decisive military operations, where it basically moves into a ground campaign to seize ground. Phase 4 deals with stability. So after they basically take over a country or an area, they want to provide security and stability to that region. And they want to basically look to impose a government that is favorable to the country that did the invasion. And then phase 5 is the redeployment reconstitution phase. And I mentioned at the beginning that my assessments were between phase 2 and phase 3. So Russia did a pretty good textbook operation, at least initially going in, and with prepping things and essentially creating conditions to allow them to have what we call air superiority. What they haven't been able to do, though, is decisively move into particular cities of any significance and hold them. We're seeing where they're looking to surround these, but they are still using standoff weapons like field artillery, basically to wear things down. And I can provide some speculation when dealing with conscript armies, low morale, et cetera, as to why they probably don't have the resolve yet to go into these cities. But they're definitely far from obtaining their objectives. And I can go into a little bit more discussion later as to, two courses of action I think Russia might pursue. One is the most dangerous, where it essentially is going to go all in, perhaps introduce chemical weapons and level cities. And then one that is probably more likely, where it will bypass significant metropolitan and large city areas and opt to secure land in the Donbass region to connect the western flank with the eastern part of Ukraine, moving southward towards the city of Mariupol, and then continuing to move westward towards to link up with Crimea to provide it with contiguous ground access to the Black Sea. And one of the things I'll basically, I think Chip has a couple more points he wants to cover, and I'll get ready to turn this over. But one of the things I'll underscore is that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a defensive organization. There's been a lot of press in the news as to why the U.S. hasn't established a no-fly zone. We can go there, but I want to reinforce that that NATO exists to serve its 30-member NATO countries in defense. Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is one of the reasons why it hasn't taken a more active stance on this. But if you recall the picture that I showed with the enhanced forward presence brigades located in Estonia, Latvia, Poland, et cetera, NATO is poised to protect those countries if Russia decides to continue to expand beyond Ukraine at a future date. So that's all I'll say for now. Chip, I'll turn it back over to you because I think you had some other points that you wanted to cover.
Thanks, John. Couple of things that I just wanted to cover briefly, and I can pass it on to Claudia or one of the other panelists. I get questions all the time from students, from friends, family, colleagues. Who really is Putin? What kind of man is he? First of all, Fiona Hill, who was on the National Security Council, she's now with the Brookings Institution. She used the word the expression that Putin is not Superman. So people need to understand that he's not Superman. He is fallible. The grand master chess player, Garry Kasparov, the Russian, has said that Putin, all chess players make mistakes. And he very clearly made a political mistake and a military mistake and a personal mistake. So the individual, who is this man? He is a man who has changed the world order as we've known it since World War II. Yes, it was pretty tense during the Cold War, but he has changed our world order. And I don't know that he's going to fit into that world order no matter what is going to happen after this is resolved, because all wars come to an end. All dictators eventually die. So Putin himself is a 69-year-old man. He was born in St. Petersburg. Actually, it was Leningrad when he was born, became St. Petersburg after the fall of the Soviet Union. His sphere of influence is St. Petersburg, from an economic perspective and from especially the oligarchs. The irony with the fall of the Soviet Union and a man like Putin, the Soviet Union was based on state ownership under a communist system, under a totalitarian and communist system. It was state ownership. It was people like Putin and the 35 other oligarchs. Oligarchs are the insanely rich people who gained their wealth after the fall of the Soviet Union, largely on oil, natural gas, and minerals. They were able to buy up all the resources. Approximately 35 very wealthy people own 99% of the wealth in Russia. So Putin's sphere of influence started with the oligarchs. If the oligarchs want to maintain their money and their style of living, they have to remain beholden to Putin. Putin, the individual, came into power when actually it's reported that he was a taxi cab driver after the Soviet Union fell. I don't know if that can be verified. He actually skyrocketed when he came back into the sphere of politics, working with the mayor of St. Petersburg. He became the director of the FSB. He himself was a fairly low-level KGB operative in East Germany, the GDR. And he eventually became the director of the FSB, which replaced the KGB. So the FSB is the Federal Security Service. He was prime minister under Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, during in August of 1999. Now, there was an election that was called for April of 2000. And that election did take place, but Yeltsin, who was very much suffering from alcoholism, turned over the reins on New Year's Eve, 1999, to Putin. Putin, in the beginning, really brought stability to Russia. It was very much a loose group of people vying for all the resources and the power, and Putin brought some stability to that. He's had a love and nostalgia for the Soviet Union. He's absolutely obsessed with it. He is suspicious of everyone. He seeks retaliation for anyone he believes has crossed him. For example, recently he put under house arrest his chief of the SVR Fifth Service, Foreign Intelligence for Pre-War Ukraine, Sergei Beseda. He's under house arrest. He humiliated his spy chief, Sergei Narishkin, on TV because things weren't going well. I mentioned Fiona Hill. Fiona Hill she's had state dinners with Putin at the same table. She said he eats nothing, he drinks nothing. He is paranoid of anyone poisoning him because it's part of his playbook to poison. He doesn't like to lose face. You've probably heard that on the news. Putin does not like to lose face. It's why this is such a precarious situation. For the US to go into a no-fly zone, as Dr. Weaver said, that is just a non-starter. He's a master at lying. He always comes up with plausible deniability. Well, those guys with the green uniforms down there in Crimea, they weren't Russians. Well, and that Russian missile that shot down a Malaysian airliner, well, they weren't Russians, even though it was all evidence leads to the fact that they were operating on behalf of Russia. So he always likes to have a pretext for invading. So, and that's why I mentioned some of the background with the historical background and some other things with Ukraine. He says that Ukraine is a country of Nazis, neo-Nazis. The Ukraine, he says Ukraine is committing genocide against the Russians in Ukraine. So these are pretexts. In 2021, Putin signed a constitutional amendment that would give him the presidency through 2036. That doesn't give me a lot of comfort. So who would be, let me just mention this, at all costs, his overarching goal at all costs is he doesn't care how many lives he loses on either side. He doesn't care how harmed his domestic economy is. He doesn't care whether he's a member of the G8 or the G20. He's lost his world stature and probably will lose it for good. So where does this bring us? Who's advising him? He has a very small inner sanctum. Putin's inner circle, this is my last point. I mentioned the Siloviki. The Siloviki are the guys that his buddies that were in the FSB, the SVR. The SVR is sort of like the CIA studying intelligence abroad. And the FSO is the Rosgvardia. Rosgvardia those are the guys in black uniforms with helmets and clubs that are hitting 85-year-old ladies who have a sign that says "Niet vojne," no to the war. These are the guys that are keeping the totalitarian regime under control for him. So I mentioned the oligarchs. The oligarchs are the very wealthy. They're important to Putin because they keep that financial stability for him. There are not many oligarchs who are influential. There's one oligarch who is influential, and that is Igor Sechin. Igor Sechin is the chief executive of Rosneft. Rosneft is the Russian oil and gas industry. So he's the chief oligarch, and with oil and gas, you have a strategic factor going forward with military and economics. Dmitry Medvedev was the prime minister who became the president between the time Putin came in. Dmitry Medvedev is fairly timid. He's a man who could replace Putin. He is not as belligerent as Putin. He's not as warmongering, but he's still someone to be concerned with because he is the deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia. Sergei Lavrov, a man we've seen on TV, on the news. Sergei Lavrov is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he's also a prominent individual. The two men that I want to mention, and then I'll end here because there are about 10 to 15 names of people. The two men that are mostly driving the architecture for the war in Ukraine. are Gerasimov, and Shoigu. And these are the same guys who developed the architectures for destroying Chechnya in Grozny and destroying Aleppo in Syria and taking Georgia in 2008. So that's pretty much what I wanted to discuss about Putin. He's driven, he doesn't want to lose face, and he has people, he has coup-proofed his inner sanctum, his inner circle. So anybody who is thinking about a coup, it's going to be hard to get into Putin. So even though I've seen 2 conspiracy theories the last 2 days, I'm not sure I buy them. Okay, I'll pass it on. Dr. Lewis, you.
Yeah, thank you. Let me talk a little bit more about humanitarian crisis that we are experiencing. So we know that by now about 2 million people of Ukrainian refugees flooded directly to Poland. And they are a little bit more than 3 million by now that are flooding in total to other countries. Subsequently, Poland is now mobilizing their national crisis management plan to avoid potential humanitarian crisis. But Ukrainian refugees are on the move. Okay, so border regions are in need of medical assistance, psychological first aid, blankets, food, immediate shelter, as many people are now facing freezing temperatures. Because when you are thinking about winters here in the United States, I'm going to tell you that that's like nothing comparing to what it is in Europe and where the refugees are coming. It's very, very cold. Temperatures can be -25 Celsius sometimes with a lot of snow. Wind chill is even making it worse. So a lot of people are really cold and need like really immediate aid in this time. People that cross the border are moving inward to Poland or other neighboring countries to find a shelter. Many of them are finding shelter with Polish families. Some of them are in refugee shelters that are managed by Polish government. Some of them stay in Poland for a few days and then move further to Europe, to other European countries like Germany, France, Netherlands, UK, and others. And some towns, and this is very important to mention since we are talking about humanitarian crisis, especially in Ukraine right now because of the shelling and war that's happening. Specifically, cities like Mariupol and eastern Ukraine have no power, no water, and no any kind of outside aid coming. People in the city are not even able to recover the dead. Children are dying from dehydration, and humanitarian aid at this time is not able to get in because shelling continues. So we hear in the news constant plead for stopping the shelling and for allowing of some of the humanitarian aid to come in, but couple attempts that were made are not really happening. So the crisis is really horrendous at this time. And those are just the few examples of the humanitarian crisis that I am just going to illustrate here for you so you kind of have a picture. Let's talk a little bit about Poland and a national crisis management plan because, again, 2 million refugees right now are flooding or flooded already, and people are still coming. So Poland has a national crisis management plan with several different scenarios. And one of the plans that they have includes a refugee crisis. And in a crisis situation, Poland has 4 basic strategies for action. And as a matter of fact, their emergency management system is very similar to the one that we have here in the United States and include 4 stages: prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. And Poland is currently obviously in a response stage. So during this stage, Poland is observing forced migration, where simply people are fleeing the war. And at this stage, Polish government set up humanitarian tents at the borders that employs nurses, doctors, psychologists, and it's providing the most basic medicine and first aid. They also are allowing many individual people that are trying to help still help. Reports are coming that, you know, people just take whatever they have, either buses or little, minivans, and they go on a border and try to help and bring people inland. Refugees are also trying to use local transportation, buses and trains, as well as, like I mentioned, private transportation to go inland. People are using social media such as Facebook to communicate when accommodations are needed. They are stuff on social media that are specifically groups that are made to help Ukraine. And people can just post things such as, I have a family of 4, I'm looking for an apartment in Krakow or some other place. And people are responding in private messages and trying to get people from one place to another. Refugees are also placed, as I mentioned, in the refugee shelter, but they also using a lot of hotels, private homes, and whatever people are willing to do to help. There is little done, however, to make sure the security and safety of the refugees. So I do need to mention that if we're thinking about those refugees, most of them are women with children, and there isn't really a system right now to assure that somebody that is being picked up in a private van gets to where they need to be. So safety is becoming an issue. There are reports coming of some people missing at this point. However, help is there, but it will soon not be enough. So Poland will need humanitarian aid and help from other countries, especially since refugees that are able to find safe accommodations now are concerned about finding jobs, learning the new language. So help is needed, but if you decided to help, I would like to make sure that you donating directly to our refugees and not to the administrative cost of the overhead agencies. So being able to donate in a meaningful way to help those refugees is very important. Making sure that your money transfers are secure. The best way that you can, the most secure way currently to move money is Venmo or GoFundMe sites. But also I would encourage you to make sure that when you do send money, that you know who you're sending your money to, because anybody can obviously open Venmo or GoFundMe. Many local churches currently that have connection in Ukraine are collecting much needed items, but also please make sure when you're donating items that they are clean and in a good condition. Most people are asking for newly or gently used clothing. So this is not the time and, you know, to clean up your closet for things that you don't want maybe use forever and stuff like that. Just make sure that you're donating things that are on the list. The items that are needed mostly include at this time first aid kits, wool blankets, sleeping bags, sleeping mats, sorrel lights, lighters, batteries, diapers of all sizes, baby wipes, dry baby formula, baby shampoos, portable cribs, dry milk, water, power bars, toothpaste, toothbrushes, deodorant, underwear, socks. And lastly, I would like to say, don't forget about our furry friends, because Poland does allow our refugees to come without papers with their pets. So there's also a need for dry dog food and cat food. Okay, list of the needed items may change. So please make sure you check with your donation places before you purchase anything. And I would like to finish by saying, imagine that you have to take your kids, your pets, and pack everything you need in one backpack and flee your country and seek a refuge in a totally new, unfamiliar place when you don't speak a language, as your life is being in danger. Many refugees are walking for days to get to a border checkpoints, so essential items are needed at this time. And if you do like to donate, or if you did donate, I would like to thank you for your kind heart. And at this point, that will be it from me. So if I would like to give it back to Vinny.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, this is great. I learned so much. We just have a few minutes left, and I want to get to some questions that are coming in. Claudia, I think the first one that I want to get to your point, is the International Red Cross or the American Red Cross a good place for monetary donations, or how should we be making sure that we're getting goods and services and money to refugees and people in need?
So I am gonna be a civilian right now and not part of American Red Cross. And I'm gonna be honest, American Red Cross does donate a lot of their stuff to administrative costs. So American Red Cross is a very good place to donate. But again, in this crisis, I would urge you to donate directly to the places that give stuff directly to our refugees. There is few of nonprofit organization that states clearly that if you donate, 100% of the profit will go towards the refugees. But unfortunately, American Red Cross is not one of them.
There are also, I'm getting other messages coming in, thank you, Claudia, that there are lists of vetted organizations that you can probably find online also that can make sure that your donations are actually going to people in need. We had another question come in a few days ago that I want to get to. Give me 1 second, I'm going to pull it up. The Washington Post and other news outlets are reporting that Russia has asked China for military equipment to help its war efforts and economic assistance to cushion the blow of the sanctions. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson has accused the U.S. of maliciously spreading disinformation. And this is for everyone or anyone. What are your thoughts on statements like these? What is the point of the U.S. announcing this type of information from anonymous sources? And the person asking says this seems inflammatory when perhaps silence may be best, or do you see this as political posturing or a warning to Beijing?
I'll be happy to take that one.
Thanks, Chip.
I'd like to thank the individual who posed that question. Definitely has valid points. What I'm finding very interesting is that the United States is starting to use some different psychology with dealing with intelligence. They've done this for a long time, but they're starting to use it a lot during this war. The US intelligence community or the government acting on behalf using that intelligence is able to, they can choose a number of tools in their toolkit. They can keep quiet. They can release a limited amount of intelligence to get some sort of a reaction. They can release a major part of the information to put the world on notice that something is actually happening. And I believe that China's reaction was probably because they were called out. I have experienced violations of sanctions over the past in my job, and people will say, oh yes, we're going to abide by the sanctions, and then they violate it. And I don't think that this was anything to provoke. I don't know that it was to definitely put them on call. And of course, the Chinese reacted, oh, who, us? We're not going to do that. That's out of page 1 in Putin's playbook. It's like plausible deniability. We would never do that. So I think it was done to expose China's efforts to backfill the effects of the sanctions on Russia. I don't think there's any question about it. It's a great question that was posed by the viewer. And I believe it has merit, but I'm happy with our intelligence community has been excellent. I believe it's been excellent. I believe that the president's usage of the intelligence has been prudent and poignant. And I believe that China is definitely has been called out. So I don't know if that answers it. John, do you want to? Dr. Weaver, you have anything?
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to offer. You covered it well. Thanks.
I have a follow-up question that has come in also that's related to that. So with sanctions, the U.S. has also begun to seize assets or freeze assets of oligarchs and do these types of punitive actions for organizations and corporations in Russia. What are the implications of these? What is the effect of these? How long are these going to last? Is this a good mechanism to actually put Putin on, on point and really call him out?
Well, I'll jump in for a second, then the other panelists can as well. As Chip pointed out earlier, Putin really doesn't care a lot as long as he personally doesn't feel the effects of what's going on. The bigger picture, though, is that the sanctions are hurting Russia. Running wars costs a lot of money, and it's definitely not helping. Now, I had seen some open source information over the last few weeks in the lead up to the war that they've been stockpiling things like hard currency, commodities like gold, et cetera, in preparation to withstanding a period of time with the invasion. But I don't believe that anybody on Putin's side thought that this thing was going to be as drawn out as it is. So eventually these things will cause significant challenges to Russia economically, and they won't be able to sustain this forever. And as Chip pointed out, all wars do eventually come to an end. With the seizing of assets by the oligarchs, it's definitely pissing a lot of people off that live very comfortable lives, and that also is not working well for Putin's survivability. Though I don't see that as a course of action. Putin has proven to be quite resilient. He's survived assassination attempts in the past, and I'm not ruling out that he'll survive this. But I'll turn it over to Chip. You might have some more that you want to add.
Can I just add something, because I think it's important to mention that those majority of those sanctions, who suffers the most are the people that are on the bottom of all of this. Those that really already have nothing, now they even have less. So a lot of those sanctions really, they hurt the oligarchs, but the people of Russia, those that really did not cause this war, a lot of them are suffering because of those sanctions.
That's an excellent point, Dr. Lewis. The sanctions that go back to the 1980s, the early 80s. Do you remember the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan, and the U.S. imposed sanctions on the Soviet Union, including the Olympics. The sanctions were circumvented by people who needed the gas. These gas pipelines go back for decades. And the sanctions against the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan did not pay off. It hurt, as Dr. Ćwiękała-Lewis said, the sanctions hurt the people who are trying to live day to day. The Japanese very clearly won, and our very own Caterpillar here in York suffered because of the sanctions. So a lot of inadvertent suffering happens with sanctions. The oligarchs are beginning to show pressure that they're unhappy with what Putin has done. Putin doesn't care. He has his dacha in Sochi. He has his dacha in the Urals, and he doesn't care what happens to him. He doesn't care about lives. So, but eventually the sanctions are going to grind his economy to a halt. So that's all I have on that. We can probably get to some questions.
I have, I think we are running over time, but I want to answer maybe like 2 more questions. We have one question that came in also that I think pulls a lot of this together, but is there any feasible off-ramp for Putin that would preserve the Ukraine's independence and security choice? I think adding to that, is there any chance that the voice and the concerns of the Russian people will make Putin change his mind? Could there be a coup? Could there be a change within his inner circle? Or, where do we go? What is that end game? And what does that look like?
I mentioned earlier, and this is just my opinion, just looking at things. So it's not based on any scientific information, but I mentioned 2 courses of action earlier. The only off-ramp I see is that if he does seize territory and is able to gain contiguous ground from Russia to the Black Sea. He could probably go back and kind of, through a repackaging of his terms, basically say, one, he expanded Russia's territory, and two, he was able to gain access to the Black Sea for Russia to basically have his legend live on without taking significantly more losses in cities like Kyiv and others. But I'll turn over to the other two panels. Perhaps they have other opinions on this, but I don't think he's just going to walk away. He's too into this now just to let things go without having some type of victory.
I pretty much agree. I pretty much agree with Dr. Weaver. He needs an off ramp. Everybody talks about the off ramp. For Putin, losing is not an option. So he has to have the impression that he's won. My sense is if nobody knows what's inside Putin's head, no one knows how this is going to play out. If I were to, I don't like to predict, but if I look into what would be Ukraine's future in the best case scenario outcome would be that Putin would stop the shelling of innocent civilians in exchange for Donbass and/or Crimea. And that might be a very, very bitter pill for Ukrainians to swallow and members of the civilized world to accept that a despot, a dictator, could go in to a sovereign country and destroy civilian populations and come out ahead. But I think that's probably what is going to be the outcome. Nobody has mentioned the unspeakables, but I do believe he would use chemical weapons if he's backed into a corner. He's used them before. He used them in Syria. He used them in Grozny, in Chechnya, and he will use chemical weapons if he's backed into a corner. He's almost backed into the corner now. As far as nuclear, I believe that his generals are probably more sober and would probably be against that. I don't know that there's a coup in the making now, but that's my comment. So
That's great. Thank you.
There's also, I just quickly wanted to add that there is also
Please.
a threat of the Chernobyl, because now Chernobyl is being taken by Putin, and he may not use maybe a nuclear weapons, but what if he does something to Chernobyl that it's like in the center pretty much of all of that. So that would be a huge concern.
Thanks, Claudia. I want to wrap this up with one last question. It's looking forward. Are there other global leaders that have the power or the ambition or like the direction that Putin is taking? And if so, do you think that this is going to change U.S. foreign policy, or how will this change U.S. foreign policy to mitigate future risks from leaders like Putin? Are we going to learn lessons from this?
I'll be happy to start on that. Dr. Weaver, or Dr. Ćwiękała-Lewis, if you have any comments. I personally do not see anyone in the current scheme of things globally. Kim Jong-un does not represent a threat. He represents a regional threat, but not a global threat. I believe that there's no one in Putin's inner circle who would step up to be as dictatorial as he has been. The fact that we've had two strong men like Erdogan in Turkey and Orban in Hungary get on board with NATO and the EU for sanctions was amazing to me. That was just amazing. There are people regionally who will wreak havoc, which historically we have that since the beginning of time. But I don't see anyone at this point. Xi Jinping is, of course, is very powerful, and he's in office for quite some time yet. And I don't view China is definitely a force to reckon with, but I don't see them in the same sphere as Putin.
I think that the crisis is so horrible right now, and people are recognizing that other countries come united. Just like what Chip just said, think people that have not spoken in the countries that have not spoken in a long time, like Switzerland. You know what I mean? Like they were neutral for so long, and this is the war that caused them to speak about some things. So I really don't think that there is anybody else out there that would really follow that footstep.
Yeah, and I'll basically say I haven't seen NATO this united in quite some time. So that in and of itself also sends message not just to anyone that might be trying to start something in Europe, but more broadly to the world as well.
That's great. All right. Well, I want to thank the three of you, Chip, Claudia, John, for taking the time and chatting with us and really giving us all this information. I learned a lot. I want to thank everyone that was able to attend today as well. We're going to continue having these types of discussions throughout the semester, throughout the year. So stay tuned, and we will be sending out more information. I'm going to say, as things progress with Ukraine, we will most likely have another session like this. So just, keep an eye on our social media and our blasts, and we'll keep everyone informed. So thank you all again for attending, and we hope to chat with everybody again soon.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.